So we have we are very lucky today with such talented speakers, and our next speaker is an amazing woman. It's Dr. Rohini Anand, and she has lots of experience. She's a senior diversity, equity, and inclusion advisor, CEO, and founder of Rohini Anand LLC. She's a thought leader. She's innovated lots of practices within companies she worked with, and where she's now advising. And she's also written a book and published author. Her book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, a guide for systemic change in multinational organizations. And she's an authority of global DE&I, and he has been endorsed by luminaries such as Indra Nooyi, former chairman and CEO of PepsiCo, Michel Landel, Danone board members and former CEO of Sodexo, amongst others. And she's also working she was recently working as the SVP, Senior Vice President in Corporate Responsibility and Global Chief Diversity Officer with Sodexo. And we worked for many years together with Sodexo. So I know her, I've seen her in practice and doing things. So we are very, very lucky here today. And also, she's been featured in Harvard Business School case studies entitled Shifting the Diversity Climate, the Sodexo Solution. And today she also serves on many boards, and it's a great honor to have her with us today.
Thank you, Kristin.
Thank you, Rohini. And I met her many years ago when we were on a trip to Morocco on a conference on women in leadership. And I remember her gentle gesture. I was freezing very much, and she had a nice shawl that I could borrow during sitting outside dinner. And I remember that very well. So that's kind of including people too. So thank you, Rohini. No, everybody has a own DE&I story. Can you share with us what brought you to the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you do today?
Well, first, I would just like to say thank you for inviting me. This is a real honor. It's wonderful to be with so many talented women. So I'm just really excited to be listening to them. So thank you very much. And you're absolutely right. I think for anybody doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's very personal for them. And for me, it's very integral to who I am. I, actually grew up in Mumbai, India, where surrounded by others who pretty much look like me. I belong to the majority religion, Hinduism, and surrounded by others like me. I didn't have to think about my identity. I had the privilege of not having to think about my identity. I will say, however, I was very conscious of my gender identity. And I remember very clearly, I was 4 years old. My mother was expecting my sister. And I was excited because my grandmother was going to come to see us and, to celebrate. And in our neighborhood, there was another lady who was also expecting her first child. And when my sister was born, I remember very clearly that my grandmother canceled her visit to come see us. And in the neighborhood, when this lady had her son, there was a lot of celebration. There was a party, there were fireworks. And it was very clear to me in that moment, I was 4 years old, it was very clear that there was something here in terms of gender difference. Now, I went on, I'm one of three daughters, so I'm the oldest. And, my parents basically gave us the message that you can be and do anything that you want and be whoever you want to be. So that I'm very, very grateful for that. But I will say that my move to the US as a single immigrant woman was an inflection point in my journey, both literally and metaphorically. And in that moment, my identity shifted from being a person who saw herself as the center of her world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, and to being a foreigner. And I was completely unprepared for that. And it was only when I was identified as a minority did I realize the privileges that come with being part of a majority. And to be honest, I was a majority growing up in India, but I hadn't recognized my privilege in that way because I was unable to until I was perceived as a minority and I experienced things differently. I was surrounded by others who were like me. So this vocation is very personal for me. I like to say that my vocation and my avocation are sort of perfectly aligned. And understanding what it means to be perceived as a minority, to be perceived as an outsider, woman in a male environment, or a person of color, minority, ethnic minority in a dominant white majority. That's what this work is about. So my work is about leveling the playing field so everyone can be successful. And I'm really, delighted that I landed in this work, and that's what I do for a living. But my work and my life are perfectly aligned. So that's my story, Kristin.
Yeah, thank you. This is amazing. And now I know, going to the organizations, because I know that many organizations struggle with ensuring that their organizations cultures are diverse, inclusive, and of course, equitable. And in a way that's sustained, not just popping up as a project here and there. And what does it take to make such a sustained culture not only come about, but also keep on?
Yeah, I would say that, this is not about, you're right, it's about culture change. And we've heard from the other speakers talking about that. It's not about a series of initiatives. It's not about just actions. It's about changing the fundamental culture of an organization. Yeah. That's what this work is about. And to be honest, this is very complex, it's very dynamic work. There's no playbook, there's no checklist. Best practices are not enough. But in my work, I found sort of 5 key principles that provide a through line in doing this work. And to be honest, a lot of your speakers spoke to it, so I'll kind of mention that. And each of these principles is simple, but they're very disruptive, okay? And I would say that they don't necessarily provide sort of plug and play templates or checklists. And I think that's been one of the foundational mistakes in doing this work, that people think that they can replicate what's worked in one part of the world in another part. And I think that's been a real error, because these principles can honestly be applied with sensitivity to any cultural background, any cultural context. And it empowers leaders to develop their own solutions without mimicking any one solution. So what I would say is that, the principles, the first one is what I call make it local. And which means that the change has to be anchored in the local context. You have to have an understanding of the history, the culture, the laws of the place, how identity is defined, how it's expressed and perceived, what the dominant and non-dominant groups are, the power structures, because these can differ depending on where you are, right? It can be based on caste, it can be based on religion, it can be based on race, ethnicity. And understanding is the first step to really developing strategies to advance underrepresented groups. But it doesn't mean accepting the status quo, because people, leaders from the outside can actually be catalysts for change. They can use and, raise issues that those within a culture can't sometimes raise because of power dynamics. But it works best when they partner with local change agents. So that's the first principle. The second is what I call leaders change to lead change. And, you've all talked about inclusive leadership being absolutely fundamental to ensuring sustained DEI change. And when leaders lead this work with purpose and passion, when they lead it like they do any other business imperative, it becomes sustained. But to do that, sometimes leaders have to have disruptive experiences that causes them a shift in their worldview in order to kind of, prioritize DEI. Let me just share a very, very quick story on this. I remember very clearly, there was a leader in Europe, and he basically didn't, believe in the business case for gender balance, etc. And I know that he wanted to network with other CEOs and belong to sort of these diversity elite companies where other CEOs were talking about gender balance. So he mentored a woman from a different company. Now this woman, they developed a trusting relationship, and she shared with him her experiences being marginalized, being discriminated, being diminished, being the only woman in the executive team, being talked over, experiences that many women have when they are the only. So he came to me and he said, I can't believe that, women have these experiences in this day and age. I don't want this to happen in my organization. And I want every one of my 12 direct reports to mentor a woman from a different part of the organization. So we have his 12 direct reports mentor women from different parts of the organization. Now, what's interesting is, first of all, he went on to become a real sort of male ally and champion. And he went on, he is the CEO of a different company in the UK. And even today, he leads diversity with incredible passion. But those 12 women who were sponsored/mentored, they were very talented women. But because of the visibility that was provided to them by these leaders, they went on to lead significant portfolios of business. They went on to become country heads. They led significant P&L responsibilities. So 9 of the 12. So, I think it goes to show that sometimes you need that disruption in order to get there. And the others I'll just mention very briefly. The third is what I call, and it's good business too. And this is essentially about the fact that you have to have a compelling change narrative, because without that 70% of change efforts will fail. But this can't be siloed or bolted on. It has to be core to your mission, the purpose of the organization, to the business of the organization. The fourth principle is go deep, wide, and inside out. And I think that Delphine talked a lot about that, how you have to integrate into the onset of your design principles, because diversity has to be infused in everything you do. Organizations are comprised of these interconnected systems, and they, work in concert with each other. And you have to infuse diversity into your processes, your policies, your systems, your structures, both in the internal and the external ecosystem. And I thought her example was about the mouse was, really good in terms of how you sort of embedded it at the outset of the design, and how ultimately what was good for women was good for everyone. So I think that's an excellent example. Then the last principle is know what matters and count it. And this is clearly about having the right metrics, like you do for any other business, and holding your teams accountable, like you do for anything else. Because otherwise, if it's a program or an initiative or actions, just series of actions, it's performative. To really make it sustainable, you've got to be working at these 5 principles at different points in time, but they have to happen in concert with each other, because this is how good business gets done. So those are the 5 principles that I think are really important to embed and sustain.
I think it's so interesting what you're saying, and I think everybody says it must be taken seriously, like any other program or any other aspects of the business, and then it will happen and it will sustain. Also, very interesting that example you gave with the man who gave attention to these women and mentored and sponsored, and hence they had a lot more success. Also, do you have any other examples of leaders that make the work local and push to disrupt the status quo?
Yeah, so I'll share an example of a leader who kind of, when I talked about making it local, and it doesn't mean accepting the status quo, but disrupting it. I'll share another example. There was a leader actually who was leading the business in Saudi Arabia. And as you know, according to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Report, Saudi Arabia is 146 out of 153 countries. And for years, Saudi women were considered legal minors. They had to have male guardians. But things started opening up when this leader was in Saudi. And given that, what he did was he started hiring more women. There were many, many Saudi women who were very ambitious, who wanted to advance their careers, and also who have a very high level of education. In fact, the literacy rate in Saudi is about over 90%. But according to Sharia law, they had to work in a separate room. They had to communicate through the intercom. They needed a male chaperone if they were going to leave for a meeting. And, viewed through a Western feminist lens, these working conditions would have been, absolutely unacceptable. And honestly, if an outside change agent came in wanting to impose sort of a universal top-down approach, they might be tempted to insist that women should be fully integrated in the workplace. But with that kind of view and setting that ultimatum, it would have been counterproductive, because women would not have been able to work over there. But this particular leader did understand the context. He said, I'm a guest. And what he did was, he saw that for women to advance their careers, they had to have an opportunity to work with male colleagues. So, but the conservative staff, male staff, pushed back. They said, no, unless they have a Saudi or Muslim man to accompany them, they cannot. So what he did was he put the dilemma back on these men, and he said, okay, that's fine. You can accompany them to every single meeting they go to. That's fine if you want to do that. Or you come up with a solution. So they came up with a very simple solution. And the solution was that if the women had to meet with men in meetings, the door of the office would be open and they would sit at opposite ends of the table. Simple solution. It worked. So clearly this leader disrupted the status quo. So it's when I say understanding the local context, it doesn't mean accepting inequities, but you have to disrupt it in a way that you partner with local change agents, even those that may be most resistant, because they know how to enter the conversation. They know the right rhythm of change. They know how to sort of make this work. So you have to be able to do that. Just another very quick example about Singapore. Singapore fortunately has reversed its LGBTQ laws, which is wonderful. But, Singapore was not a gay-friendly country. And several years ago, about 5 years ago, Barclays and a couple of other companies like Google, etc., actually sponsored the first Pink Dot Festival in Singapore. And this was celebrating the LGBTQ community, and they used their power, their privilege, their money to really support local change agents who wanted to carve out a safe space for the LGBT community in Singapore. Now, by the time the government banned multinational companies from sponsoring the Pink Dot Festival in 2017, it had already gained enough momentum, and there were lots of local companies that had taken charge. So that kept it going. So this is sort of another example of how companies, even in a country where the laws were not gay friendly, right, they were able to come in and disrupt the status quo towards more equality, but doing it in a way that understands the context and in a way that respects the context, but at the same time pushes for change and partnership with local change agents. So that's disrupting the status quo, which is different from disrupting a leader's worldview, right? The example I shared of the leader, that was disrupting his worldview, so he came across as a male champion.
But this is also great examples on how we can be the change agents, and use our power everywhere at an individual level and as an organization. Just I'd like to ask you also a piece of advice for other people here in the room that is doing DEI globally today.
Yes, I mean, I think we've heard, the progress in this work has been painfully slow. We heard about women exiting the workplace, as a result of COVID. In fact, we've gone back to 1986 levels in some parts of the world, which is really, frightening. We heard examples about the metaverse, about VC, and how few women we have, and this is the future. So clearly, we're making progress, but it is painfully slow. And I think the reason for it being painfully slow is oftentimes companies actually think that these initiatives are a nice to have and not fundamental to the business. So, and they see it as sort of a checklist of activities. So when companies, go through economic hardships, what happens is the first thing to go is the DEI efforts. Or they make these lofty statements. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. I know in the United States, Kristin, after George Floyd was murdered, companies pledged $60 billion for racial equity initiatives. Now, a year later, only $250 million had been spent. So it's great to have these, the speaking out is very easy, but really stepping up is what takes work. So my advice to folks is really, ultimately transformation happens at the intersection of processes and people. And it's a very personal and a professional journey for each of us. It's an ongoing journey. We must all examine our own self-awareness, our own behaviors, and use ourselves as instruments for change. We've got to, be allies to each other. And we've got to really sort of use our voice to disrupt the status quo, to bring male allies along. I think we've got to meet them where they are and bring them along in the process, because the partnership is absolutely necessary for sustained change.
Thank you. Interesting. Meet them where they are, everybody where they are in some ways, and move from there. So, and I want to have a last quick comment from you before we move on, which is, where do you see and what do you see as the future of the ENI, and what is, or rather, what is this moment calling for right now? And then also a last call to action, please.
Yeah, so the future is, I think it's here to stay. I think that the world around us is changing. We have things happening all the time, whether it's COVID or the refugee crises, or technology. I mean, these things are dynamic and changing rapidly around us. And I think that organizations have to respond in a way that they take into account what the external trends are, but continue to focus on their employees and create this sense of belonging for their employees. So, it's here to stay. We have a lot more work to do in every aspect. So I see that, happening for a long time to come. And I actually think that addressing these issues is the very thing that can lift organizations out of challenges, by downplaying the commitment during crises is really not a very smart move, because these are the very things that can lift organizations out of crises. There's enough research that shows the financial outcomes and benefits, etc. And I think we have to focus on it not just when it's breaking news. So I think that, I think we can do things at the organizational level, and many of your panelists actually talked about sort of integrating DEI into the processes. And to me, it's really sort of disrupting those systems that have supported the success of some and disadvantaged others, right? So you have to eliminate those harmful practices at the organizational level. I think that, organizations are linked to the broader society, and customers and employees are asking for organizations that are purpose-driven. And they want organizations to take a stand, a daring stand on injustice in communities. Employees are asking it, customers are asking it. So I think organizations need to do more of that. And then at an individual level, so there's a real need for true allyship. But what we've seen very often is sort of this performative allyship, where people want to prove that they're what in the US we call woke, right? And are not taking the necessary actions. They're speaking, they're talking the talk, but not, walking the walk, if you will. So we really got to make sure that we, are there for, and that takes curiosity, to kind of understand where your growth is, self-awareness and curiosity. It takes courage to seek out disruptive experiences. And it takes commitment to take action, to really embed diversity into the organization's DNA. So my call to action is, let's step up and be, allies to each other.
Allies to each other, Thank you so much, Rohini. It was amazing listening to you and to hear your experience, your wisdom, and your knowledge. And I want to remind everybody about Rohini's book. It's also a guide for systemic change in multinational organizations. And I think the word systemic is very, very appropriate here when we are leading global diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I see some people in the chat has already written that they have read the book and that they highly recommend it, and I will do the same. So thank you very much, Rohini.